In 1943, deep inside occupied Europe, German engineers laughed at American vehicles. To them, the US Jeep was a crude toy, a box of bolts and wheels thrown together in haste. They called it the go-kart of democracy, convinced that no real soldier could depend on something so small, so simple, so American. The Wehrmacht worshipped engineering perfection, gears polished to silence, engines built like watches, design that bordered on obsession. But perfection had a price. It was slow, fragile, and expensive. The Americans built something different. Theirs was a machine that could climb, crawl, swim through mud, and still start after a week in the rain. When the Germans finally captured one in North Africa, they took it apart with smug curiosity. But what began as mockery soon turned into silence. The deeper they looked, the more impossible it seemed. Every bolt, every lever, every angle had a purpose. It wasn't sloppy, it was brilliant in its simplicity. That day, one German officer whispered what no one dared admit aloud. We could never have built this, because we would never have allowed it to be this simple. Before the war, Germany prided itself on engineering that bordered on art. Every weapon, every vehicle was a masterpiece of precision. Tight tolerances, complex systems, immaculate design. German officers often said their machines didn't just fight, they performed. In Stuttgart and Berlin, automotive engineers built armored vehicles like sculptures, hand-assembled and tuned with the patience of watchmakers. To them, the concept of mass production was an insult to craftsmanship. Every part was tested, polished, and inspected until it gleamed. And in peacetime, that obsession created icons: Mercedes, BMW, Auto Union. But in wartime, it created a problem. When the Blitzkrieg rolled into Poland and France, German vehicles looked unstoppable. But the deeper the Wehrmacht moved, the more its logistics strained. Complex engines demanded rare fuels. Over-designed transmissions broke in the mud. A single replacement part could take weeks to arrive from factories hundreds of miles away. Across the ocean, American factories were building something completely different: simple, rugged, replaceable. A machine built for soldiers, not engineers. The United States called it the Willys MB, but to the world, it became known by a single name: the Jeep. Its design looked laughable to European eyes. Flat panels, no doors, no luxury. It wasn't beautiful, it was blunt, but that was its genius. The Jeep could be stripped, repaired, and running again in minutes. It could haul wounded men, tow artillery, or cross rivers with its snorkel pipe above water. It didn't need perfection, it just needed to work. In 1942, American production lines were turning out thousands every month. Each Jeep took less than a day to assemble, its parts interchangeable across factories. Ford and Willys followed one blueprint so perfectly that their components could be swapped without adjustment. That idea, standardization, was alien to the German mind. When German scouts first spotted the Jeep in North Africa, they called it a rolling box. The Afrika Korps had sleek motorcycles, staff cars, and half-tracks, but they often bogged down in sand. The Jeep didn't. It skipped across dunes like a metal insect, bouncing, light, unstoppable. Rommel's officers couldn't understand it. How could something so crude work so well? They captured one near Tobruk. Its driver killed in an ambush. The vehicle looked intact, dust-covered but running. German mechanics gathered around it, curious and amused. They poked its flat hood, kicked its tires, scoffed at its simple dashboard. Typical Americans, one said. No refinement. But when they started dismantling it, the laughter faded. There were no unnecessary parts. Every piece served a function. The wiring was color-coded. The engine was accessible from every side. The suspension flexed without breaking. They realized that what they had mocked as primitive was in fact perfect for war. In that moment, the Germans understood the terrifying truth. America's greatest strength wasn't its weapons, it was its practicality. The Jeep didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to survive. As one engineer wrote in his report, this vehicle could be repaired by a child. It is not German, but it is genius. The Jeep had become the symbol of American design philosophy: freedom, adaptability, and speed. And soon, that symbol would appear on every battlefield on Earth, carrying not just soldiers, but an idea that simplicity can defeat sophistication. When the captured Jeep was brought into a Luftwaffe repair depot outside Tunis, the German mechanics treated it like a joke. They pushed it into the hangar between the wrecks of captured British vehicles and stripped Panzer engines waiting for parts. A young officer laughed, "A toy for children, not soldiers." They gathered around it. Officers, engineers, even a few mechanics with oily hands, ready to confirm what they already believed, that American machines were crude and careless. But as the hood lifted, the laughter stopped. The four-cylinder engine sat clean and simple, with space all around it. No tight compartments, no hidden bolts. It could be reached, repaired, and replaced in minutes. The fuel system was accessible from one side. The wiring loomed like a diagram come to life. It looked almost too simple, and that was the point. One engineer scoffed, "They make this for peasants. No finesse." Another replied, "Perhaps that is why it works." They started the engine. It roared to life with a single turn. No adjustments, no warm-up. The sound filled the hangar, a low growl of confidence. A mechanic muttered, "Our Kübelwagen needs prayer to start on cold mornings." The others ignored him. The next day, the engineers began what they called the durability test. The Jeep was driven across sand, gravel, and loose rock. It bounced, tilted, rattled, but it never stopped. Its suspension flexed like a living thing, its tires cutting through the terrain as if built for it. When the driver finally brought it back, dust-covered and dented, it still idled smoothly. They checked the oil, clean. Checked the engine, no leaks. They tried again, harder this time. The officer in charge ordered, "Drive it into the ditch." The driver obeyed. The Jeep plunged nose first into a trench, the front wheels spinning, the back end kicking up sand. The Germans laughed again, certain it would stall. It didn't. The driver shifted to low gear and climbed out of the trench as if nothing had happened. A few of the onlookers applauded without thinking. Others looked away, embarrassed. One muttered, "It's not engineering, it's witchcraft." A week later, the Germans conducted a third test, long-distance endurance. They filled the tank, loaded gear into the back, and drove it across the desert for 3 days straight. No shade, no maintenance, no mercy. When they returned, the Jeep was caked in dust. Its windshield cracked, but it was still running. They wiped the sand from the dash, turned the key, and the engine purred, as if it were brand new. The final report from the Africa Corps engineers was short and reluctant. It read, "The American light utility car is crude, but effective beyond expectation. It is superior to the Kübelwagen in maneuverability, repair time, and engine endurance. Recommend study of its design," but there was a line added by hand at the bottom of one copy, written in pencil by a frustrated mechanic. "This machine is ugly, loud, and impossible to kill." By the end of 1943, hundreds of Jeeps had been captured, tested, and catalogued. Every report returned with the same conclusion. The vehicle's simplicity was its greatest weapon. It could be repaired by anyone, anywhere, with anything. One officer joked that if a Jeep broke in half, 2 men could carry it home and bolt it back together. The joke wasn't far from the truth. American manuals even showed soldiers how to fix one with a hammer and wire. For the Germans, whose training relied on specialized tools and endless procedures, this kind of flexibility was unimaginable. The Jeep didn't just change how the enemy saw American machines, it changed how they understood American thinking. The Reich built perfection. America built reliability. One broke when reality intervened. The other adapted. At night, as the desert cooled, German officers would sit beside their tanks, staring at the little captured jeep parked nearby. It looked almost alive, its silhouette sharp against the moonlight. "If this is what their smallest machine can do," one said quietly, "what do their factories look like?" Another replied, "Like nightmares, we cannot bomb fast enough." The more the Germans studied the jeep, the more it confused them. Its blueprints, obtained through captured documents, made no sense to their design philosophy. There was nothing elegant about it. No heavy armor, no over-engineering, no precision tolerances that required hand-fitting. It was, by all of their standards, wrong, and yet it worked flawlessly. At a testing field near Kassel, a team of engineers from the Wehrmacht's Motor Transport Division began the impossible task: reverse engineering the American Jeep. They disassembled one piece at a time, laying every part neatly across tables. The frame was basic steel, the bolts standard size, the engine a simple inline-4. They found nothing miraculous, no secret alloy, no hidden trick. What baffled them was how these ordinary parts came together into something extraordinary. Colonel Weber, head of the testing unit, stood over the stripped chassis and frowned. "There is no precision here," he said, "and yet it fits like a glove." A younger mechanic replied, "Perhaps precision was not the goal." They tried to reproduce a copy. They had factories, they had talent, but when the prototype rolled out weeks later, it failed almost immediately. The steering jammed, the suspension collapsed after a short run over dirt roads. German design instincts had ruined it. They had made everything too tight, too refined, too heavy. Weber slammed his notebook shut. "We improved it," he said bitterly, "and by improving it, we killed it." Meanwhile, intelligence reports told them that American factories were producing jeeps faster than they could destroy them, one every few minutes. German plants, under bombing and shortages, could never match that pace. Even if they could replicate the design, they could not replicate the philosophy behind it. In the months that followed, the Jeep appeared on every front. In Italy, it climbed mountains no truck could handle. In Normandy, it raced over sand and rubble. In the Pacific, it forded rivers and jungle roads. For the Americans, it became more than transport. It became a symbol of mobility, of reach, of freedom that moved. Captured German soldiers often saw them up close. Columns of jeeps darting across battlefields, carrying officers, medics, and supplies. They were fast, fearless, and everywhere at once. The Germans started calling them Der Teufelwagen, the Devil's Car. In late 1944, a damaged jeep was captured in France and sent to Germany for further study. The team that received it treated it with respect this time. They cleaned it, checked its engine, and ran diagnostics. To their surprise, the odometer showed over 30,000 kilometers, most of it in combat zones. Still, it started with a single push. The engineer who turned the key whispered, "It's like it refuses to die." They pushed it harder. Freezing weather, deep mud, rock climbs. The Jeep kept going. At one point, its oil pan cracked on a stone, leaking fluid. The Germans laughed, thinking they'd finally found its limit. But then they saw the American field manual tucked inside the glove box. Inside was a note: "If oil leaks, use soap, cloth, or chewing gum. Anything that works." The mechanic reading it laughed in disbelief. "Chewing gum? They repair with candy." Weber looked at him. "They repair with whatever they have. That is why they win slowly." Admiration replaced arrogance. Reports began to circulate among the engineering corps, not as ridicule, but as respect. Some officers even suggested adopting elements of Jeep design for post-war vehicles. Others dismissed the idea. It didn't fit the German ideal of perfection. But the younger engineers, the ones who had seen their tanks stuck in mud while the American Jeeps zipped past, understood what their superiors could not. War was not about beauty, it was about survival. As the winter deepened, one of the captured Jeeps was tested again in the snow. The Germans ran it day and night, cold starting it in sub-zero temperatures, driving it over ice. The windshield shattered, The tires froze, but the little engine kept turning. One morning, a soldier came out to start a Kübelwagen parked beside it. The German vehicle refused to start, even after 10 minutes of cranking. The Jeep, sitting right next to it, fired up instantly. The men stared at it as if it were alive. One of them murmured, "Maybe it just wants to go home." They began calling it Der kleine Amerikaner, the little American. What had begun as mockery had turned into reluctant affection. At the end of their report, Colonel Weber wrote a final line, one that would be found years later by Allied investigators after the war. The Americans have discovered a new kind of engineering, one that forgives the man who uses it. By 1944, the Jeep was no longer just a vehicle, it was a symbol. From the beaches of Normandy to the frozen fields of the Ardennes, it appeared everywhere, climbing hills, splashing through rivers, roaring across mud, where even tanks dared not go. To Allied soldiers, it was a friend. To the Germans, it was a ghost that never stopped moving. In the chaos of war, few things stayed reliable. Radios failed, trucks sank, tanks broke. But the Jeep never seemed to quit. It carried officers to the front, hauled ammunition, ferried the wounded, and served as a command post on wheels. Mechanics said it had a heartbeat. Soldiers said it had a soul. Every division wanted more. German troops began to fear its shape on the horizon. Small, fast, unpredictable, it darted through smoke and shell fire like an animal that couldn't be hunted. It brought medics, scouts, even generals into the fight. The same machine the Germans had once mocked was now outpacing their army. On the Eastern Front, a group of German engineers, retreating from Poland, spotted a captured Jeep, still running after weeks without maintenance. It had bullet holes across the body, a torn seat, and a missing headlight, but it moved as smoothly as if it were new. They stopped to inspect it, but the sound of engines behind them forced them to flee. Soviet troops were coming, riding jeeps supplied through Lend-Lease. For a brief second, the engineers saw the irony. The machine they had ridiculed was now chasing them. Even Rommel's officers, who had once joked about the toy car of democracy, changed their tune. Reports from North Africa noted that jeeps were being used by special forces to raid German convoys at night. They struck like lightning, silent until the last moment, headlights blacked out, engines muffled by sand. They appeared, attacked, and vanished again into the desert. One captured German officer described it later. They came from nowhere. Dust, noise, fire. And when the smoke cleared, we were staring at empty ground. Only their tire tracks remained. In the winter of 1944, a column of jeeps raced across Belgium, carrying wounded soldiers through the snow to field hospitals. German artillery shelled the road for hours. When it ended, rescue teams found the jeeps still running, radiators cracked, wheels bent, but engines alive. Mechanics called them miracles. Engineers called them indestructible. Back in Germany, at an underground design bureau near Munich, a few surviving engineers from the Castle Group met to discuss post-war ideas. One of them brought photographs of the Jeep taken during testing. They studied the lines, the joints, the welds. "It is not perfect," one said, "but it is honest." Another added, "We build machines that need us. They build machines that free them." They talked about the war as if it were already over. The bombing had destroyed their factories. Fuel was running out, and yet the little American car kept appearing in every propaganda photo, climbing, pulling, surviving. The engineers didn't hate it anymore. They admired it. Secretly, they wished they had built it first. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the Jeep had become part of the scenery of victory. Soldiers painted names on the hoods, tied helmets to the fenders, and called them family. When the Germans surrendered, hundreds of jeeps rolled into Berlin, carrying troops and journalists. One German officer watched from a window as the convoy passed, small, dusty vehicles rumbling through the ruins of his capital. He turned to the man beside him and said, "So this is what defeated us." Not the machines we feared, but the ones we laughed at. For months after the surrender, captured jeeps continued to run on German soil. Farmers used them to clear debris, engineers used them to rebuild bridges. The machine designed for war had become a tool for recovery. In a strange way, it had changed sides. It now served the people who once tried to destroy it. Karl Weber, the colonel who had overseen the early tests, saw one again in 1946. It drove past him on a muddy road near Munich, still wearing faded American stars on the hood. He smiled faintly. "It survived the war better than any of us," he said. He turned to the young engineer walking beside him and added, "Remember this. Sometimes the simplest design hides the deepest intelligence." That line would stay with the man for decades. Years later, when German industry rebuilt itself, when Volkswagen and BMW began producing simple, reliable vehicles for a new world, that lesson guided them. Perfection was no longer about complexity, it was about endurance. The Jeep had proven something greater than engineering. It had proven that the real measure of genius wasn't how much you could add, but how much you could take away and still win. By spring 1945, the Reich was collapsing. The roads that once carried panzer divisions now carried refugees, retreating soldiers, and silence. But one sound still echoed through the mud and rain, the steady rumble of engines, light and fast, moving always forward. Jeeps, hundreds of them. American, British, and even Soviet units driving the same machine that had once made German engineers laugh. In a ruined village outside Cologne, a column of jeeps rolled past shattered buildings. German prisoners watched from the roadside, mud-caked, starving, beaten. One of them, an older engineer named Colonel Weber, recognized the shape instantly. It was the same design he had tested 2 years earlier in North Africa, the same machine he had mocked, studied, and quietly admired. Now, it was driving past him, pulling artillery, carrying medics, soldiers, and flags. The sound of its engine, steady, defiant, seemed to mock the ruins around him. For a moment, he almost smiled. "Of course it's still running," he whispered. The Americans who guarded the prisoners didn't pay attention to him. They were too busy unloading supplies. One of the jeeps stopped nearby, its driver jumping out, a young corporal with mud on his face and a cigarette in his mouth. The hood was dented, the windshield cracked, but the engine kept ticking. When Weber saw that, he couldn't hold his curiosity. He stepped forward carefully. "Excuse me," he said in English. "How long have you had this vehicle?" The American turned, surprised to hear fluent English from a prisoner. "This one? Since Normandy," he said proudly. "Crossed France, Belgium, the Rhine. She just won't quit." Weber nodded slowly. "I tested one of these once. Years ago." The American laughed. "Then you know why we love her?" Weber looked at the Jeep. The scratches, the patched fenders, the ropes tied to the grille. It was ugly, loud, imperfect, and yet it had crossed an entire continent, while his own tanks lay rusting behind him. He asked, "Do you know who designed it?" The soldier shrugged. "A bunch of companies, I think. Willys, Ford, whoever could build it fastest." The answer made Weber pause. In Germany, design came from hierarchy, orders from above, executed by those below. Here, it came from cooperation. A dozen minds, building one idea together. He realized that this was the true secret. The Jeep wasn't the product of one genius, it was the product of freedom itself. That night, in the prisoner camp outside Cologne, Weber sat alone by the fence. Beyond the wire, American soldiers were laughing around a fire. The same Jeep sat parked beside them, its headlights dim, its hood steaming in the cool air. They were using it as a table. Maps spread across it, coffee cups resting on the fenders. It wasn't just a machine. It was part of them. He remembered his first test in the desert, the arrogance, the disbelief, the reports he had written. He had called it crude, inelegant, a temporary machine, and yet it had outlasted the Reich itself. His own factories were dust, his superiors were gone, but that little Jeep still rolled across Europe, carrying the victors into a new world. He opened his small notebook, one he had carried since Africa, and began to write. They build like they live, together, without fear of failure. Their machines forgive mistakes. Ours demand perfection. That is why theirs endure, and ours die with us. When he finished, he closed the notebook and looked up at the Jeep again. A gust of wind lifted a flap of its canvas roof, and for a moment it looked like the flag of a nation that refused to stop moving. Weeks later, as the Allies occupied Germany, engineers from every side toured the captured depots. Among the destroyed tanks and aircraft, the Jeep stood untouched. American soldiers used it for everything, from carrying food to escorting generals. The irony was inescapable. The smallest vehicle of the war had become the backbone of victory. In one of the reconstruction meetings after the surrender, a British officer turned to the German representatives and said, "Gentlemen, take note. The future belongs to machines like this, simple, strong, and free." Weber never forgot those words. He returned home to a city in ruins, his uniform gone, his rank meaningless, but in his mind he carried one image: the Jeep bouncing over the rubble, carrying food and medicine to the same people who once called it trash, a machine born in war, now rebuilding peace. Years later, when asked by a journalist what he remembered most about the war, he didn't mention tanks or planes or battles. He simply said, "A small American car that refused to die." The journalist asked why that mattered. Weber smiled faintly, "Because it taught me what no general could. Power isn't in complexity. Power is in endurance." The Jeep had outlived empires, outlasted weapons, and outshined all of Germany's mechanical pride. And in the end, it had proven one simple truth: the strength of freedom is not perfection, but persistence. When the war ended, the world was exhausted. The machines fell silent. The guns stopped, and the men who survived returned home to ruins and memories. But among the wreckage, one machine kept moving: the little American Jeep. It rolled through the rubble of Europe, not as a weapon anymore, but as a tool of healing. Jeeps carried doctors into destroyed towns, ferried food across broken bridges, and pulled civilians from the debris of bombed-out cities. Children waved as they passed, touching the hoods, staring at the white star still painted on the sides. To them, it wasn't an enemy's car. It was a symbol of rescue. In one village near Munich, Colonel Karl Weber saw a Jeep again. He was no longer an officer, just a man trying to find work and meaning in a country that had lost both. The Jeep stopped beside him, its American driver waving, before tossing him a cigarette. "You need a lift?" he asked. Weber smiled faintly and shook his head. "No," he said, "but it's good to see you again." The driver didn't understand the meaning behind those words, but Weber did. The Jeep was the same one he had seen in Cologne months before. Same dents, same scratches, still running. It felt almost immortal. Over the next few years, Germany began to rebuild. Factories reopened, streets cleared, and engineers returned to their drawing boards. But something had changed. The obsession with perfection, the pride that once blinded them, had been replaced by a new philosophy: function before form, practicality over pride. And that transformation was born in part from the memory of a small four-wheeled American machine that refused to quit. In the early 1950s, German automotive companies quietly studied American vehicles. They didn't copy them. They learned from them. They learned that efficiency came not from complexity, but from clarity. That strength was not in how much metal you used, but in how well it endured time and wear. And so began a new chapter, the rebirth of German engineering with a different heart. Volkswagen's Beetle, BMW's new sedans, Mercedes' post-war designs all carried echoes of what the Jeep had taught them: simplicity, reliability, accessibility. They no longer built machines for pride. They built machines for people. As for Weber, he never forgot the lessons of that little vehicle. He started working in a small repair shop in Bavaria, teaching young apprentices how to design with purpose. On his workbench sat a single keepsake, a Jeep bolt he had pocketed from the test site years earlier, rusted, worn, but intact. He used it as a paperweight. Whenever a student tried to overcomplicate a design, he would tap the bolt and say, "Build it so it forgives mistakes." That is real genius. Years passed. The world changed. Nations rebuilt, and rivals became allies. American soldiers left Europe, but the Jeep stayed behind, passed from army to farmer, from soldier to mechanic, from war to peace. It became the blueprint for modern off-road vehicles, a machine that could conquer mud, mountains, and history itself. In 1960, a young German journalist interviewed Weber for a documentary on wartime technology. The camera rolled as Weber, now gray-haired and calm, told his story. "We had the best engineers," he said, "and we lost to the simplest machine. Because it wasn't built for glory, it was built for purpose." He paused, smiling softly. "When I saw it cross our ruined country after the war, carrying food and hope, I realized we hadn't been beaten by a machine. We were beaten by an idea, the idea that progress belongs to everyone, not just the few." The documentary aired across Germany. Viewers were struck not by bitterness, but by honesty. The Jeep, once mocked as crude, had become a symbol of endurance and humility, the virtues post-war Europe needed most. By the time Weber died in 1978, the world had built faster cars, bigger machines, and sleeker designs, but none of them carried the same spirit. The Jeep was still on the road, older, scarred, but alive. Some of the same vehicles that had crossed deserts and battlefields now climbed farm roads and mountain trails, engines still humming the same steady rhythm. In a box among Weber's belongings, his family found a small note written in fading ink. It read, "The machine that mocked us taught us more than victory ever could. True strength is not in what you can perfect, but in what you can endure." The Jeep had done more than carry soldiers. It had carried a lesson across generations. It proved that genius doesn't need polish, and that freedom, like the machine itself, was built to survive rough roads. And long after the war ended, the sound of its little engine could still be heard echoing through the hills, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things drive the greatest revolutions.